Welcome to the premiere episode of BeastPC. Today we're gonna run a very interesting experiment. We're gonna install 8 operating systems all on the same computer. Every major version of Windows way back to Windows XP, macOS Catalina, and Linux as well. System specs are the following. The CPU and motherboard are an Intel Xeon E3-1225 CPU on a Gigabyte Z68 motherboard. RAM is 8 GB of DDR3, perfectly sufficient. In fact, most builds of XP can only recognize 4 GB, but we installed the 64-bit edition that detects all 8. Continuing, the 2 drives are a 128 GB Kingston A400 and a 1 TB Kingston KC400. This video was not sponsored by Kingston. Our GPU is an XFX HD 7850. For internet connectivity, we use this PCIe Wi-Fi card, which is a NV-FV T919 with this Broadcom chipset, and it supports AC Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 4.0. Other system specs include a decent 500-watt power supply, generic USB mouse and keyboard, and a Full HD 1920x1080 monitor. Let's cue the installations. Starting with Windows XP 64-bit, installation was frankly pretty hard. You need to use something called the Easy to Boot installer. A channel called Phil's Computer Lab actually has a video just about it. Windows XP is pretty strict about actually needing a CD to install, and this tool has a workaround for that. But the OS installer needs to be loaded into the system memory, and despite having 8 GB of RAM, it could only detect 500 MB, and so it failed. After diagnosing for a few hours, it turns out that allocating less system memory to the iGPU VRAM would solve the issue. We were able to load the OS right into memory, and installation went super smooth. And once we boot in, we're straight onto the desktop. And first order of business, change the theme back to the all-time classic Luna, and the wallpaper to the most iconic photograph ever taken, the rolling green hills of bliss. In 2008, more than 90% of PCs used Windows XP. Also, this tool comes from Russia, so some part of the system is in Russian, and we're going to go change that back. Now let's go to install our drivers. Right off the bat though, AMD's latest XP driver doesn't work, probably because it's a beta driver. We got a code 10 error in the device manager, and after a few hours of diagnosis, we installed one of the older drivers with a green icon and it worked flawlessly. Except there's one major bug. You can't go to 1080p, there's gonna be a black edge around the screen, and so the max you can go to is about 1600 by 900 without this issue. Once installed though, the OS is a huge hit of pure nostalgia and it runs great. Now let's install Windows Vista. The installation process is pretty similar to Windows 7, 8, and 10 since Microsoft basically reused the same installer. After the out-of-box experience, we're greeted by some ridiculous advertisement. I mean, the whole OS is just slow. Even with our pretty powerful hardware and an SSD, it feels laggy, and at the time of release, it was definitely a disaster. Mid to low-end computers back in the day simply didn't have the power to drive this complex OS. Now, installing drivers, again, no new drivers of course, and so we have the same resolution issues. However, the Wi-Fi driver worked even though it's marked for Windows 7 and above, although there was no luck with the Bluetooth. Finally, we arrive at Windows 7, one of the best operating systems there are, in my humble opinion. It's brighter than Vista, and the arrow theme is absolutely beautiful. Microsoft must have optimized its performance compared to Vista, since Vista was truly terrible, and Windows 7 is really good in this comparison. It comes with new features, and very importantly, it's reliable. The start menu and search works, the control panel works, and compatibility is great. It doesn't have bloatware and unnecessary garbage like Windows 10, and speaking of the great things, we have support for the latest AMD drivers. It's an all-round super pleasant experience even in 2020. We now arrive at Windows 8. In fact, it's still supported by Microsoft. However, AMD dropped support for it in their drivers. It's definitely a disappointment, but they do have a point. Windows 8 and 8.1 combined have a market share of less than 6%. When we try to boot the OS, it's clear why. It's just bad. The start menu is a disaster, you can't find the power button, and searching Windows enters a full screen page. The old AMD drivers have the same resolution issue we mentioned earlier. Moving on to Windows 8.1, it's just a lot better than Windows 8, but it's mostly the same thing. In fact, you can still download it from Microsoft. They added the power button back to the start menu and the search works a lot better. Still wouldn't recommend this in 2020 though. Finally, after surviving through so many painful installations, something modern and familiar. You may argue against Windows 10 for reasons like Cortana is quite useless, that it comes with bloatware, Edge sucks, and the settings app is terrible, but you can't deny that it's one of the easiest OSs out there that you can install. Very little drivers are required and almost all driver installation is taken care of automatically. For most people, GPU drivers aren't even necessary since Windows grabs it automatically. We're finally back to the classic start menu, there are no more ridiculous full-screen apps, and the task manager compared to Windows 7 receives even more features like GPU monitoring, and in version 2004, they actually added information about the disk and GPU temperature as well. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for gamers to switch is the better game optimization and the official support for DirectX 12. As for the Hackintosh, installation is complicated enough to merit its own video, so we'll be releasing that soon and we'll skip it for now. After installation though, everything is a breeze. Our PCIe Wi-Fi card makes everything 100% functional and all features work. It's snappy and it's nice and it syncs well with the rest of the Apple ecosystem. It's a great system for anyone who likes a Mac. If you don't like using macOS or Windows, you only really have one other option, Linux. One of the most famous distros is Ubuntu, and there are a few different versions of Ubuntu as well. We'll use Kubuntu today, and it ships with the KDE desktop manager instead of GNOME. Linux is more lightweight and easier on the hardware than Windows 10, however we do have some driver issues. We attempted a few things like installing open source drivers since there seem to be no official AMD drivers for the newest version 20.04. After some research though, we did arrive at a solution and everything worked well. So, conclusion time. Obviously, this is a really impractical experiment and most of you probably only want to use Windows 7 or Windows 10, and there might be a few fans of Linux or macOS out there. However, most of the hardware worked great and delightfully, our motherboard had no issues. The main problem though was with the AMD graphics card. There's no way around it, AMD just doesn't write drivers with the support or the stability that Nvidia offers. However, through all the pain, we took a great trip down the nostalgia-filled history of modern personal computing. If you like this video, leave a like and please consider subscribing. See you next time.